Good day, folks. I'd like to talk to you today about scalar waves. It's very important, in my opinion, anyways, because in some of our energy systems, I believe that is the scalar potentials in part or in much of the phenomena that is responsible for the various effects we're looking for. And to be able to better understand that, we need to know what scalar potentials really are. And because of the limited information available and the quote unquote secretive nature of such, the information even today is quite fragmented. And if you follow people like Tom Bearden, he likes to shift from his early 90s work to his later work on what the definition of scalar was. And it's very well the same thing if you follow Tesla's concept, and then you follow others who talk about scalar potentials, and they all have, different ideas but similarities. And of course, the one we're all familiar with is the cancellation of fields. So a lot of the scalar talk is focused around that effect per se, but what I've realized is a lot of people, anyways, what I've looked around, they don't actually get into the fine details on why it is we're actually doing that and why it is it does that. And I want to just explain it today. And this is, my own reasoning and trying to put the pieces together so I could better understand it. I've been doing more research about a week now since my quantum energy generator, back to the basics, and I'm trying to brush up my understanding on the scalar waves. And this time around, it seems like some things are going, aha, how come I missed that the first time? So in the order of transparency, I'm sure it could help a lot of people who are also following this field. So first, as I said, in my own, everyday person terms, I want to visualize what a scalar wave is and how a scalar wave operates. And when I look at the traditional information that's available with scalar waves, very typically the one we know most is the canceling of the fields. What we see basically is two sine waves, and then they show you, okay, so we create a 180-degree phase, so they're in opposites, so that every time, they're canceling each other out and creating a scalar potential. Okay, but it's very difficult to visualize. So I'm going to try and make it easier for you. But first of all, we need to understand something here. It's quite complicated, and to really understand what's going on with the scalar potential is you have to understand also the Poynting vector flow. And ironically, it's not something that we talk about in traditional electronics, yet in physics, it's been many years now, it's been proven, especially with it was a Nobel Prize with the two charged plates that wanted to attract each other, that actually proved, that we do have the vector potential. That would be the Poynting vector. So what happens with this is, now if we want to introduce the Poynting flow, we can really understand better what's going on. So I'm going to show you a chart of the Poynting flow, but first we're going to look at the regular AC waveform, and I'm going to show you something here. It's very basic, but it's probably going to make you say, ah, that's why. So let me explain. So first thing first is we're going to go and look at a regular waveform. So here it is right here on the screen for you. Alright, so taking a look at the typical sine wave here of an AC system, we can see the waveform using a regular run-of-the-mill, nothing modified, just a regular AC circuit. This is how it will appear on the scope, right? Now, if you take just a moment to look at this waveform, you will see that just as is, at some point there is a sum zero. You notice that as where the red dot is, as it appears to get close to the zero there. So that doesn't mean, folks, that at that point there's no more energy available. It just means that at that moment it is sum zero, which then is the converted. You can't destroy energy, it just gets converted to that scalar potential. So what I'm getting at, folks, is naturally in natural systems there is always a scalar potential. However weak it may be and not optimized, it is always there. Now it's very easy to see it in this diagram, and I always wondered, like people like Bedini who used the traditional words, like, he would refer to his voltage as a scalar potential, and I'm thinking, why was he using that? We're not talking about scalar, but in this context, you could see that we are. So, it was right there in the traditional wording. We just don't use those words anymore, and we usually discard in regular electrodynamics these scalar potentials, but they are very well there with every system. Now, naturally speaking, in the DC system, it's going to be different, right? And let's look into a DC system. I'm going to show you a basic closed loop circuit with the light bulb that we're all familiar with. So here's that right now. All right, here's a typical DC circuit we're all familiar with. This is not AC, so we don't have that rotating magnetic field here. So we don't necessarily have, even for a slight moment, that zero. But it may still happen in the DC circuit, folks, and it does happen in the DC circuit because when you understand what happens is there's no such thing as a stable 100% DC. There will always be in circuit variance and fluctuations. Even the power supply, even the battery will have transients that could be seen as a form of AC. They may be very, very tiny, micro, maybe unmeasurable with our equipment, but statistically speaking, they are there and they will appear at random and as noise and parasitic on DC systems. So with that said, my whole point is any energized system, from your household equipment to your stereos, everything generates a certain amount of scalar potential. As minuscule as it may be, there is always a scalar potential involved in any electrical system. Now, with that said, let me move on to essentially the human brain. All right, so here's a diagram of a simplified functioning of our neurological system, and according to the chart, it's very easy to see, visualize how the electromotive force is introduced and where the field propagates from our biological brains. So with that said, because there's a field present, it means there's a scalar potential as well. Now, understanding scalar potentials, how it's basically a space-time kind of interaction, this is essentially, folks, what I'm saying is backing up that every human brain has its own unique biological scalar wave signature. And with that said, this gives scientific understanding, real science, it's in quantum physics, that would explain much of the what we consider the psychic and paranormal phenomena, because understanding how the scalar waves works, this is how a brain would simply interact. It's not what I'm getting at is it's not to be mean and to break the news to people who think they're very special because they're psychic, they've been chosen by a higher order or something like that. In very simple terms, if we were to compare this to going to the store and buying a cheap brand radio stereo versus an expensive brand, you have a different version. So what happens is your receiver is going to be more sensitive than the other receiver. So they're the same thing. So I'm comparing it to the brain here, but different brands will have different sensitivity, and not one human being is the same. So just like how we are all expertise in different domains, some people are art while others expertise in physics. It all depends on how we're wired as we're born, and some people will naturally have this greater, what I like to call scalar radio abilities, and they'll use it. So with that said, my whole idea, my whole point is in all of this is trying to show everyone that the scalar potential is a very natural thing that basically is founded in the fabric of our reality itself. That's what I'm trying to get at. All right, now let's take a look at the Poynting flow, which matters a lot, which helps us better visualize the scalar potentials and how it happens here. And if you look at the Poynting flow, you can see in the sine wave that there's actually an oscillation going on with this stuff in between the inside the cycle of the waveforms. So we can see what happens now when we look at just a regular waveform. This would be AC in the diagram here. We can better understand where and y, the fields cancel each other out. You could literally see the x point there on the chart, and we actually have additional information now. It's not just a waveform. We could actually see the actual pointing flow that's responsible, well, at least shows us how and why the sine wave does what it does. So with that said, this is an AC system, and this is basically the big revelation, folks, I'm trying to show you, is that in an AC system or any oscillating field, the scalar potential, or in other words, the zero-sum fields, are already built into every kind of electric wave. So essentially, again, scalar potentials are a natural thing and is already built in. So this is very interesting because it supports the idea now that when Tesla was experimenting with his coils, he didn't need to do any fancy windings and fancy phasing and all of that stuff, because he took advantage that there's already a natural scalar potential. So as weak as it may be, it works very much like traditional amps current. You want a more of a scalar potential, like a Tesla coil. You send that oscillating field at high current, high voltage, that naturally increases the scalar potential, effectively acting as an efficient scalar system, a transmitter of sorts, but taking advantage of the natural systems. Now, what does that mean? Again, it always seems to boil down to this. Our current science is like always backwards. And why are they doing this? I have many theories, but I'm not here to spread conspiracy. I just want to get the facts out, so I will move on with that, but making the point that our science understanding of electrodynamics is completely backwards. And if you're following along, what I'm getting at is we see it all in reverse. It's actually the scalar potential that comes first, and the electromotive force, folks, is just the byproduct of the scalar potential. The sum zeros are already built into any electrical field out there. It's already there. So basically, the scalar is the time reversed. So you're actually, if you want to get really into the quantum of it, when you turn on any electrical circuit, the circuit actually goes back in time, maybe not measurable in our sense, but for a moment, because it's the scalar potential that starts, and then it's the effect of the electromotive force that we tap on. Now we have this silly notion of trying to engineer the electromotive force to create the scalar potential. We actually have it all backwards, folks. So why are we doing it this way? And I will try and explain you the more traditional concepts of scalar waves and try and make the link for you for better understanding. All right, with what we know now, let's go back to a little bit a la Tom Bearden for a little bit with his AC generator example that many of you have seen before him mentioned, and he does point out a pretty good example, but unfortunately he leaves out a certain some facts here, and I don't know if it's done intentionally or to deceive, but you know, he's generally right, but from time to time he gets deceptive, and people have called him out on it during this time that he was alive, when he did have various inconsistencies. So I just want to point one of them out right now. So we all know this is the AC generator, a very straightforward, easy to see diagram of how the AC generator operates. So the AC generator spins and induces a field into the coil, and the rotor interacts with that and then induces the field into the light, and the current flows into the light, out of the light, and back into the generator. So as Tom Bearden explains, for this process is a closed loop. So what happens is, to initiate this loop, half of your energy, literally 50%, is reserved, and completing the loop goes back into the generator, while the circuit eats up the additional losses. So with this system in mind, this is why, and what he was stating at, that over unity on its own will never be possible with a closed loop circuit that operates in this silly notion that we have here. So, but he's partially wrong, because he goes on and says that the other 50%, which indeed does go back into the generator, is like having a sumo wrestling match within the generator and nobody wins, and that energy Essentially, what he's trying to say is that energy is destroyed by the generator, and understanding the conversion of energy, energy cannot get destroyed or created, only manipulated. And of course, Tom Bearden knows this, so why did he basically make it sound this way? So what I'm going to explain to you in understanding how I was saying every AC field has its built-in zero sum built into the waveform, what happens is when it returns back into the AC generator, it's 180 degrees out of phase. So that's actually the cancellation happening at the generator right in the coil. So that energy, that essentially that 50% that just goes poof, doesn't actually just goes poof, it just intermittently becomes a scalar potential at that point that radiates out towards the coil as a scalar potential, usually completely discarded and wasted. Now, if we could figure out a mechanism to collect this wasted scalar potential, we could potentially put it back and recycle that into the circuit to avoid those traditional losses. It just makes sense, folks. But in order to do that, there is no known way if we run silly closed loop systems. So this is where Tom Bearden is right. We must break the symmetry, we must break the loop, and we must introduce asymmetrical regauging. And if we could tap off the scalar field and put that in there, then we actually have a chance. But I don't understand why he didn't explain this in relation to his AC generator when he just calls it a day when he says it's a sumo wrestling match and the generator loses, insinuating, it's destroying the energy. The energy doesn't get destroyed. Yes, we see a net zero for a moment, the sum zero. However, it gets converted as a scalar potential, which is another kind of energy, but very well there, just not in electrical format that we want to see. So this is what happens here, and I just wanted to explain it in easy to understand terms, and I really feel that Tom Bearden missed out on this point, and it's a lot easier to understand along with the pointing flow vector, all of this interacts. And of course, looking at it in an AC generator, it's not simply manipulating AC fields with an intermittent scalar potential by feeding the input back into the output essentially, or vice versa. Being always phased at 180 degrees, that half you're always going to convert to something else, and it will appear as a traditional loss, which isn't really a loss, it's just converted into something else. So that's the final point here. Alright, so everybody knows what this is. It's a very basic Tesla coil, and back to the basics here. My philosophy is if you can keep it simple, keep it simple. And the Tesla coil is the perfect example of a naturally occurring scalar wave transmitter without having to really engineer the EM components of it very much. We're taking advantage of the natural zero sums of the AC waveforms. Now, the Tesla coil naturally builds up or high potentials, so that will naturally amplify the scalar potentials as well during the zeroing. So what happens is the Tesla coil actually is an excellent, as I stated before, high-powered scalar generator, actually using natural systems. Now, my point is, again, why I think that the science is completely backwards on this. We have the notion of trying to engineer the effect rather than the cause, which is completely backwards in many ways because we can only go so far. But of course, it matters when you manipulate the secondary systems, such as the EM fields, but it doesn't end there. And you will never get the great magic by simply doing that. You actually have to engineer the cause and not the effect. So why are we doing it backwards? So my point is the Tesla coil is a fine example of using the natural systems of scalar waves and taking advantage of the natural amplifying phenomena and banking on that for a high-powered scalar transmitter. Now, if you understand this concept, it only makes sense to try and find various methods such as building Tesla coils if your goal is to build a strong scalar wave generator. So you want to actually engineer the natural systems and not the side effect. That's where the big power and the big effects come in. So now let's say we use this philosophy. If we engineer our Tesla coil and devices to create these high potentials with using natural systems, we have a very high powered scalar generator. Now you're going to say, well, wait, what about all this 180 degree phasing and cross windings? Yes, that's engineering the EM part of it, and that matters a lot as well. But like I said, you can only go so far. So, for example, if we start off by a really amplified natural scalar potential, let's say we use then, let's say the goal is to actually, for some reason, we want like 100% scalar and very powerful. Then what we would do is use two Tesla coils, for example, mirrored with each other with some sort of controller at 180-degree phase. So what happens is the two Tesla coils now, not only with their natural high potentials that we engineer, they will use those high potentials to cancel each other out at all times, creating an even massively unimaginable scalar potential. See? But by doing that, we actually had to engineer the effect that causes the natural scalar potential in order to be able to increase the EM potentials. So yes, we do work with both systems, but it's very important that if you really want to see the massive energies, you have to engineer this natural scalar phenomenon directly to notice the effects we want on the EM version of it. So with that said, Tesla goes on with his, and a lot of people are questioning this, his so-called death ray, right? And as to date, no one has been able to successfully replicate, or as we know it, this technology, yet there are some diagrams of how it works. Again, like Tom Bearden, Tesla leaves out a few things here. So, what people who are the little that people know about scalar waves, generally speaking, they don't look at the natural phenomenon at all. They figure and they use their theories and they tell you, you have to do crisscross windings, you have to phase at 180-degree, and they call it a day. There's no other way. They don't take into consideration there's a natural scalar phenomenon going on in all electrical systems, which is very unfortunate for them to see it that way. But the point is, yes, they will be able to generate scalar waves that way, just using that system, but they will be extremely inefficient at doing it. If only they would consider the underlying principles, they could work with both and get a much massive system if they would understand that now.
All right, here's a current, we can say, traditional understandings of how the Tesla quote unquote death ray should operate. And there's basically two modes of operations here, as you can see in this chart. First one is we use two regular transmitters, and all we do is basically the same frequency, phased at 180-degree, and focus the beams with antennas to where we want, as in the picture, and where the zones X is in, those are where the scalar waves would appear. But unfortunately, you need to do more than this, because a scalar wave on its own, obviously, folks, can be that destructive because we're immersed in them all over. Our realities would shift, our consciousness would go scrambled. So again, back to how scalar potentials are very natural in the fabric of our own universe kind of thing. So if you want to do these fancy effects with scalar waves, that's actually only part one of the equation, and a lot of people stop there and they call it a day. You need more than the scalar action on its own. So with that said, let's take a look at the second mode of operation, which would be actually using two different scalar waves at 180 degrees. And again, very similar idea, but in the zeroing zones, you get an RF. Again, concentrated RF energy, may it be, 500 watts, a million watts, is not going to crash, melt, metal in the sky. I mean, we're exposed to such RFs every day, and especially in urban city environments. You know how much power those commercial radio stations at half a gigawatt actually put out in ERP? I mean, it's pretty amazing. But the point is, no one's dying, no one's boiling, no one's heating up. So, it doesn't end there, and that's where everybody stops. Now, I'm just making the links here, trying to complete with what everybody says. And again, this is where Tom Bearden is probably right, but he doesn't get into the juicy details. But here's the thing, right? If you actually want to do what this is supposed to do, you need to do more than that. Looking at optics, for example, if we really want to create a real you need to introduce phase conjugate replica mirrors, or I have a hard time with the sequence in that, but phase conjugated mirrors essentially. So it would be the scalar equivalent to that, and Tom Bearden again talks about this without getting into the details, unfortunately, but I'm going to try and put in those details for you and fill in the blanks here. And what he means by that is to actually complete this picture here. Let's look at the first one here, which is regular waves. You would actually need, see, this is showing you only half the picture, folks. You would need, you would need the two transmitters, which would be two traditional transmitters phased at 180 degrees. That would be part one, beamed at a location. But as I said, that's not enough. You need to introduce that phase conjugation mirror. And in order to do that, you would actually have to use then another set of transmitters, which are actual scalar transmitters, like on the bottom one there, also phased at 180 degrees, and have that beam go into the other beam. So essentially, you need four systems to be able to create the proper time reversal signal to interact with the scalar and EM to produce this destructive interference. Now, I'm sure the Russians and whoever experimented with this knows this and conveniently, for some reason, left it out. Who knew, right? Now, some people over the years have contacted Tom Bearden for clarity on this, clarification. And the best he's ever done is essentially say, I can't say anything, confidentiality agreements with some of the inventors that brought this to surface. I can't say anything, have a nice day. So, too bad it ended there, right? I'm just trying to fill the blanks for you, trying to make it sense in plain English, just trying to give you the facts, folks. I hope it sheds light on any of this, and I sure know that it did for me. And this is a thorough review that will get me thinking from this point on, working with my quantum energy generator and likewise devices. Again, let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.